Hi, my name is Eryn O'Neil. I am from the US. I live right in the middle in Minnesota, which is basically almost Canada, which will become relevant for reasons later revealed. But it's nice to meet you all. Good morning. Let me give you some context on me because, like 4 people in Europe know who I am. So I'm a PHP developer, which means I don't want to hear it. Okay. I've been writing it for 10 years. I've seen the ugly, I've seen the less ugly, I've seen the good. But this is not a PHP talk, so you can stop freaking out. I am a technical lead. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means on a later slide, but that's how I sort of identify myself. And I'm an independent with a background in the agency world. So the agency world, I don't know if that's a term that translates, but it means people who get hired to write websites for other people. So I don't work at product companies generally. I work shorter term contracts on behalf, sometimes of product companies, but other times on someone who needs a smaller piece of software. There's a huge range there. And the reason that this is relevant is that during this talk, I'm going to say things like clients. And if you don't have clients, that's fine. That's my language, so I'm going to use it. But if you don't have clients, when I say that, hear stakeholders, or hear users, or hear whoever it is that's requesting features from you. When I say budget, if you don't have literal budgets, you should hear how long you have to get something done, in a more general sense, because none of us can just work forever on something and not lose our jobs, right? So we still have constraints. I'm going to use my language. I want you just to translate it into whatever makes sense for you. So you maybe have recently become a tech lead, aren't one yet, but think maybe you'd be into it, or already do some kind of senior management, senior team lead stuff and want to get better. The other option at this conference is that it's a single track, so you have to sit here. And I'm going to do my best to be entertaining for you. But if you're at this conference, you're probably already fairly senior in your company, right? So they don't usually send people to polyglot conferences that are like junior. So I think that there will be things here that will be useful for everybody. And if you are junior, you're totally awesome for being here, by the way. So there will be things here that hopefully you can grow with. So if you haven't figured it out, I'm not giving a code talk today. I'm the talk that got brought in to give your brains a break, because we've been doing some really dense stuff since this conference started. Really, really complicated, just fairly involved, talking about all these languages and how they work. So I'm going to not talk about that. It'll be great. What I am going to talk about is tech leading. So let me tell you what that means to me. It's a term that is used, at least in the States, I think in other places. And sometimes it's a title, but a lot of times it's like a project role. So maybe you're a tech lead on this project, but then you're just like a normal civilian on other ones. And it's, I think, really well encapsulated by this quote. So the tech lead is the owner of the technological vision of a project, and they're the technical leader of the project team. So what that means is that it is different from some other roles that might sound similar but aren't quite the same. Say a product manager who is deciding what goes into a product, who is making calls, who is figuring out what features we're going to write, who is maybe talking about how we're going to write them in the order, but they're not writing them. That person is not almost ever implementing the things that they decide that we need. Similarly, a PM, a project manager, might be very involved in figuring out, how are we going to get this thing done? We're trying to get this done on the day-to-day. We're trying to implement it. But what they're not going to do is the technical part. And then you've also got like a senior developer who is definitely involved in the technical part, is definitely part of figuring out how are we doing this? What stack are we using? What language are we using? What are we going to build that lasts? What are we going to build that's kind of throwaway for right now? But what they're not figuring out is the how do we get it done? They're not necessarily looking at that big picture of the project. They're very focused on one part of it, and that part is likely very complex. It's likely based in architecture, but it's just one part. A tech lead is a little bit of all three of those things. So it's somebody who sees this bigger vision for what a project can be and what it is, and they have, and bigger vision for what it is, and they have the context around it. It looks a little different everywhere. So every place has a different set of expectations, deliverables. It makes it kind of hard to talk about this stuff. So I'm picking language that works because we need a shorthand. But again, please translate this into whatever works for you. There's a different set of expectations and deliverables everywhere. Maybe you write the code. Maybe you have to figure out requirements. Maybe you have to talk to clients or stakeholders or users. Maybe you have to launch the thing. Maybe you don't do any of those. Maybe somebody else does them. But the bottom line is, pardon me, at the end of the day, it's about making good software with a team. Because there are a lot of things that change from company to company. Tons of things that change from even team to team within a company. And if you're not working on software at a company, now you have a whole new set of variables. But the one thing that is consistent on all software projects that you ever work on is that there are people involved. And people are similar in more ways than we're dissimilar. We're governed by fairly basic psychology most of the time, which means we're hackable, which is good, because we like to hack things. So if we approach our projects realizing that they're comprised of people, and the people need to be figured out as much as the code or as much as the language or the stack, we're going to be more successful, no matter what our title is or where we fit into this ecosystem. So I'm going to give you 3 different tactics to help you think about how we're going to do this. And it's going to be full of specific things that you can take back to your teams or your wherevers or your open source projects or whoever it is that you need to manipulate into writing better software with you. And hopefully you will be able to manipulate them using these tactics. So 1, facilitate. 2, advocate. And 3, motivate. So facilitate, help your team do their jobs. Your job is to help other people do their jobs. 2, advocate. You need to keep the big picture in mind on a project. So it's really fun to talk about all of this specific implementation stuff, but we also need to see the wider context. And 3, motivate. Figure out how to get your team to the best possible result. I am going to go into deeper detail on all of these, but this is sort of our roadmap. This is the scaffolding that we're going to use as we go through this. So first, to move things forward, we're going to facilitate. Your job now is to help other people do their job, if this is what you do. If you're in some kind of leadership role in a project, you're there to help other people get something done. So you want to be removing roadblocks. You always want to be saying what's next. It's a great sin to leave someone blocked. If someone on your team is unable to work, the overall efficiency of the team is completely reduced. So you have to be going after the things that are keeping people from working. Making sure that they can get into the GitHub repo. Making sure that they have credentials for whatever servers they need to be on. Making sure that their development environment is ready before their first day starts, at least to the extent that you can do that for them. You want to get things out of the way. But more than removing roadblocks, because that's reactionary, right? Someone comes to you and says, I have a problem and I can't get this thing done. More than removing roadblocks, you want to anticipate them. Perceive the need is a phrase from Minnesota, which, how to explain Minnesotans to a room full of people who've never heard of them. So it's a culture where it is fairly rude to ask for something. It's very implied. Oh, I'm really thirsty. Oh, wow, I really like your sweater. What they're saying is, give me some water and give me your sweater. So it's a culture where you sort of imply. And because of that, it is polite to try to anticipate what people are going to need so they never have to ask you. So it becomes this sort of like back and forth guessing game of figuring out how to satisfy people's needs so they don't have to be rude. So here's a story. I was at my brother-in-law's house, and I was eating pretzels, and they were delicious, and they were salty. So I wanted a glass of water. So I turn around to ask, and he's standing there with a glass of water. And I'm like, oh, hey, that's funny. I was just going to ask you for that. And he goes, I know. Pretzels are salty. And it was really weird. But then I married in, so I guess it's not like that. It wasn't too weird, but it was weird. You want to do the same thing for your developers if you can, for the people on your team. You want to make them uncomfortable with how prescient you are at perceiving their needs and anticipating what they're going to need. So if a developer on your team is going to need an API key to get work done on Friday, don't wait for them to ask you. Just go apply for it on Tuesday. If they're going to need access to some server, ping the admin now. Make it a game where you try to get in front of whatever could stop them and see how long they can have an unbroken streak of productivity thanks to you. One way to help with this that I really, really like is using tickets, hours, and burndowns. And if we have any PMs in the room, they just got like really excited because the programmer said that they like burndowns. But I love burndowns. They are ammo for a conversation about this isn't happening fast enough. They're data. I love data. I love estimates because it takes some of the emotion and the guessing out of these conversations about how long is it going to take to get something done and how are we doing. When you leave emotion in a conversation, it can turn into a back and forth. It can turn into a, no, I don't think so. Well, I do. Well, I don't. Well, I do. And now you have nothing. But if you have some data, like some estimates that you've all agreed on, and you've put them into the system and you're making burndowns out of them, a burndown chart, by the way, if you're not familiar, just realize that maybe that's, again, not a concept that translates. It's a chart of the hours left on a project, and as you finish tickets, it goes like this, in theory. But what it really does is it goes like this, and then this happens, and then you find something else. But eventually, the overall arc is that one day you run out of hours to finish. So you want to use these as ammo in these arguments. So when a boss comes to you and says, hey, we wanted this to launch actually next week, so can you make it launch next week? Instead of being like, no, you can say, no, here's the burn down. We have 3 weeks left of work. So now we have to figure out what we're going to do about that. So it gives you something in these conversations where you have sort of maybe a power imbalance, where a boss can be like, no, because I said so. You can come back with, well, I have data, so what are you going to do about it? And now you at least can have a productive work through this thing, as opposed to just being like, well, I guess we're all working 24 hours a day. You want to know the answers, or at least where to find them, because people are going to come to you with everything now, because that's your job. Your job is to know things. And even if it's not explicitly your job, the longer you work somewhere, the better your rep is, and the more projects or pieces of software that you accumulate, the more everybody's going to come ask you for things. So it's not actually possible to necessarily know everything, but you at least want to know where to point people. I think of myself as kind of like being a router, where people are like, how do I? And I'm like, ask Sam. And they're like, how do I? I'm like, ask Jenny. And I just send people off to the place with the information that they need. So then I don't have to answer the question or even necessarily know it, but I look really smart. If you know who has the information or where they can find it, or you can teach them to Google for themselves by giving them the right keywords to look for, or suggest a resource, you've helped move them along at the cost of what? 10 minutes of your time? People are going to come ask you for advice, so you may as well have strategies about how to deal with this. But you do need to think about overall team efficiency. Because, yes, if you get interrupted, the cost to ramp back up again and get focused, that is very real cost. But on the overall team efficiency measure, it might still be worth it. So if someone asks you a question, they take 10 minutes to try to figure it out, and then they come and ask you, and you take 10 minutes to work on it. And then they leave, and it's 20 minutes for you to get kind of back to the point you were at before. That's 40 minutes. But if they would have spent 2 to 3 hours trying to figure that out on their own, in the aggregate, the team is more productive. It's just at the expense of you. So it's a different way to look at a job, but it's a very important role on the team because, in general, it's going to keep everything moving along. It's just at the expense of our own code, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But your job is to be interrupted now, so I'm sorry. However, it is fine not to know something, but never ever admitting it as an excuse. I don't know should burst joyfully from your lips, followed by, but I will find out. This is a quote from somebody who will be very mad at me if I call him my mentor. He's someone I used to work with. He made it really clear to me that he was not my mentor. But he's really smart, so I listened to everything he said anyway. And I think this quote is amazing. One, because it shows you exactly how he talked all of the time. But two, because it's true. You don't have to know everything. You can't know everything. You should admit when you don't know things. And I realize that that's maybe scary for some people because I have trouble with that. That's, again, basic human psychology. But what it means is that you have an opportunity to go forth and find the information. And this is great because you should use this not just as a way to answer the question, but as a learning opportunity. So for example, at the agency, I had to work with DNS a lot. For every single client, I had to do something with DNS. But I didn't work with it often enough to really learn it. So I had to go talk to the admins and say, this client needs to transfer their DNS. Where should we host it? We need to put it on this server, that server. Are we going to manage their email? All of these things. And when I went to them, I could have just said, give me the answer. Like, here's the situation. Please tell me what to say to go talk to their admin so I don't look really dumb. But instead, I said, what's the answer? And please explain why. And that meant that over time, I became a lot better at answering those questions. And the admins loved it because they didn't have to tell me the same thing over and over again. And if there's anything sysadmins can't stand, it's that. So I got to learn this stuff. And now I'm an independent consultant, and I don't have an admin to ask. So that's really good because I use this all the time. But it means that I was getting increasingly better. And that's job security. So you want to be accumulating new knowledge as much as you can. Second point, to do things right, you want to advocate. So advocate for your developers, for the budget, for the client, for whoever's not in the room. And remember that all software does have clients. It's just maybe users, or it's maybe the other team that's requesting this software from you. But there's always somebody who is at the end of that process that you can keep in mind. Pardon me. So we want to advocate for whoever is not in the room. To do that, you need to have the 10,000-foot view in your head so you can make decisions about what to do on the ground. And what that means is if you have the full context of the project, then you will be better able to deal with all of the different levels of advocacy that will come up. So you want to try to know the whys of decisions, not only the whats. But you're only human. So I recommend that you write everything down. Write down every conversation that has any impact on anything. Write down conversations in hallways. Write down conversations that you have over in meetings where something's decided. Send recap emails. Send like a lot of recap emails. These can save you. And the reason is that they save us from something that I call, again in a cultural reference that might not travel, we'll find out, Groundhog's Day meeting syndrome, which is a Bill Murray movie where he wakes up every day having the exact same day over and over again. Groundhog's Day meeting syndrome is when you go into a meeting and you are all there with very strong opinions and you're arguing about how to implement something. And by the end of the conversation, no one has strong opinions because all of you are completely demoralized and exhausted, but you've at least decided something. And then next week, you have the same meeting because somehow no one remembered. Or, more likely, the one person who matters doesn't remember. I had a manager like that once. Wonderful man. Made us have the same meeting all the time. So if you write things down and you send recap emails and you explain, look, we already decided this, and here's why. When you get back into those meetings, when you get in those situations where someone wants to rehash something, you have evidence. You have a paper trail. You can pull it up and you can say, hey, this is what we did, and that's why we did it. And the why is important because how many times have you had a conversation where you were able to say, hey, we decided to do it this way, and the other person goes, I don't know why we would do that. That doesn't make sense. We should really do it this way. It's like, you were there. I don't understand. So if you can write down your explanations, you are more likely to avoid these kinds of situations. So how to advocate when talking to whoever's not in the room, right? So first, when you're talking to developers, you're advocating for the users, the clients, management, business realities. So you're talking to other devs, and they are going to want to build things really fancy, because that's what we do. We really like building fancy things. But we don't usually always have time for fancy things. So you have to remember to bring people back and give them a reality check of like, look, we got to get this done in 2 weeks. Or, hey, you want to make this thing, but here's the context of why we decided to do it that way. And that's where this understanding the big picture comes in. You want to be able to give developers context and information about why you're making the decisions you're making. Because we, as smart people and developers, are a little ornery, a little standoffish. We like to fight. So when someone comes and says, do this, my instinct is to be like, no. But if you come to someone and say, hey, this is why we're doing this, here's the story, here's what the client needs, they're more likely to accept the answer without a fight. And two, they might have something to add. They're smart. That's why they work there with you. They're probably smart. No, they're smart. That's why they work there. So if you give them the information, they might come up with something you didn't come up with, which would be great, because now they're making your job easier. When you're talking to management, your boss's boss, the PM who talks to the boss, you want to advocate for the developers, for the code, and for the users. Most of the time, they're thinking really hard about the user or the stakeholder, whoever it is, so what you're really doing is advocating for developers. And that's when you want to say, the code has standards for a reason, right? So we're gonna not let the tests, we're gonna not write tests. We're going to build it this way because writing it any other way would be miserable, and we don't want to deal with it for the rest of time. We are going to make sure that what we're doing is advocating for the health of the project and for the health of our lives going forward. And finally, when you're talking to clients, you need to sometimes just say no. Sometimes people want something and you have to be able to be like, no. And that can be hard depending on your relationship with whatever you consider your client. But that's making sure that this thing will get done in time. When you say no to any of these people, though, I strongly recommend that you don't just say no. Say no, but. No, but if you give me a week, I can add that feature. No, but for another $10,000, we can absolutely build that. No, but we're going to need 3 days of exploratory before I can even come back to you with some sort of realistic estimate of what that's going to take. And at that point, they might say, cool, because it's important to them. Or they might realize that nothing in life is free, and you'll find out it wasn't that important to them, and they'll be like, oh, yeah, never mind. I don't want it enough to pay for it. But most importantly, you need to say no to feature creep. That's advocating for the project. I kind of got a reputation at my last job for being like, no, you can't do that, it's out of scope. No, that's out of scope. No, that's out of scope too. And there was one day that a developer on my team came up to me and he was like, hey, I was thinking, I know that we're just writing this feature. By the way, I signed NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, so all my stories are like, someone did a thing and then someone else did another thing. So I'm sorry, I can't give you details. But the developer came up to me and he was like, hey, I want to write this. I know we talked about this solution, but with another like 40 hours, we could write something that is really, really gonna like take us all the way. But I knew you'd say no, so I didn't even ask. And then he just turned around and walked away. And it was amazing. I was like, I'm so proud. That's good. That's good. I got my team thinking about these things too. So you want to be able to say no, because you need to ship this code, and if you keep adding features, you'll never ship it. To get things done, thirdly and lastly, you need to motivate people. We know from psychology experiments that the most efficient, effective form of motivation is intrinsic. So what that means is you can't just tell people to do things, which most likely we in this room don't have the authority to do anyway. We don't have the authority to say, you need to do this, this is your job. Because we're probably peers with these people we're trying to motivate. But that's really good, because it means you can't cheat. It means you got to do it really well. See, I don't want to scare you, but tech leading is a form of management. It's the good kind, though. It's the kind where you're genuinely trying to help people do their best work and find what motivates them so that they will do it. You might be able to be a better manager than your manager if you do this stuff well. Ooh, sorry, wrong button, friends. So the first key to this is your attitude. You are going to set the tone for the team. No one can be more optimistic than you. No one can be calmer than you. So if you're panicked, your whole team is at least that panicked or more. If you're pessimistic, if you think that this project will fail, your whole team also thinks this project will fail. So you need to figure out how to be, sorry, not my normal clicker. You need to figure out how to be chill, much like I just wasn't. You want to figure out how to be the wall in front of the water that all of the crazy runs into. Hits you, splashes on the ground, and your developers are behind you, happy, calm, and dry. If you can figure out how to guard them from the nutso machinations of what makes a software team run in a business, then they are going to be more productive, and they'll like you better. And that's always a nice bonus. So my third tactic is passive-aggressive whiteboarding. And here's what I mean by that. I'll tell you in a story. So another team I was working on, we were working on a very large system. It was e-commerce plus. And there was one part of it that I was pretty sure we weren't like worrying about enough, we weren't taking seriously enough. So I kept trying to talk to the developer working on that part, being like, hey, I really would love if you started this part earlier, because I have a sense that it's bad. You know, we're gonna run into trouble. And he was like, no, it's fine. I figured out how I'm going to do it. I'm not worried about it. I'm going to do these other things first. And I would be like, well, I would really love. And he'd be like, no, we're cool. And that's it. I mean, what do you do from there? I said, I think. He said, he thinks. He's the one doing the work. So I had nothing. So after a couple weeks of this and totally freaking out, what I ended up doing was I got him in a room. And I said, hey, can you just whiteboard for me? Show me how you want to do this. And what I found is that if you ask a developer to explain something they're really into, and especially something they wrote that makes them look good, you can't get them to shut up. So, got him in the room, and I said, can you show me how you're planning on writing this? And he was like, yeah, sure. So he's writing, and I'm like, oh, what about this one? And he goes, I'm good, I got it. And he did. So he's writing out how else, and I go, well, okay, but what about, he's like, got it. And then I go, well, okay, but what about, and that was the moment that I could see his face, simultaneous realization, a light bulb above his head, and just dread. Because he realized what I had suspected already. He knew it at that point. And so he was motivated by his own fear to go and figure that part out. But it was something that I had been saying for a while, and it just wasn't working. He wasn't hearing it. So this is a really, really useful way to get people to know what you already know. Here's the reality of this. The paradox here is that you're not writing the code, but it's your responsibility if you're in charge of a team. So now you have to get people to do things, but you can't tell them to do things. But if they don't do them, you look bad. It's a really, really messed up chain. I'm selling this job, aren't I? I know you want this job now. But there are things that you can do to make it better, and they're the things we've just talked about. The last thing that I'm going to recommend that you do is minimize risk. So you've got to go after the parts that scare you the most. Whatever looks like the scariest black box, whatever you want to work on least, that is probably the thing you should start with. And you want to look for answers until you're not scared of it. You want to look for answers until it is not something that you don't understand. Because those are the places that are going to have the dragons. Those are the places that are going to trip you up. And you're going to put them off for a long time because they're scary and hard. So those are things like the new hotness JavaScript library that your developer wants to use. Those are things like the language you just learned about this weekend that you want to go write home, you want to write about. These are the language that your coworker decided they want to write in, but you don't care about. You got to figure these things out. Finally, I just want to acknowledge this before we finish. It can be hard to code when you're a tech lead. Because coders work on the maker schedule, but tech leads are on the manager schedule. The maker schedule is long chunks of time, 4 hours at a time, focused, uninterrupted. But managers, they work in half-an-hour blocks. They have meetings, they have coffees, they interrupt people, they have stand-ups. So if you want to do both these jobs, it's hard, and you have to figure out how you can make them fit together. And you need your leadership to agree. They need to also understand that your code output cannot be as high as it once was, because now your metric is the whole team. Your metric is not your lines of code, it's the team's lines of code. So don't try to hold yourself to the same standard you were at before. You won't succeed, and you'll just feel bad. It's a different kind of job to lead a team. To review, facilitate, advocate, motivate. Help your teams do their jobs, remember the big picture, and guide people to do their best work. Thank you very much.